Good morning. If I can ask everyone to please find their seats, put your cell phones on vibrate or quiet mode, and let me welcome everyone to the campus of George Washington University. Let me thank you for taking time out of a beautiful day to hear what we have to say today. And without getting into any great specificity, I'll save any of my commentary for the Q&A session, but I definitely have a couple of thank yous that I want to underscore before we start here. Firstly, thanks to the chairman and my co-chairs of this project, Admiral Dennis Blair and Nuala O'Connor. Without their tireless effort, this project would be nothing but a concept and an idea, so thanks to everything that they put forward. Let me also thank Sarah Sorcher and CSM Passcode, our co-hosts for today. Sarah will be moderating a panel with three of the chairmen. Unfortunately, Secretary Chertoff couldn't join us today. He was coming in a little later, and we figured we couldn't keep anyone who has kids here in the afternoon on Halloween, so we decided to go in the morning. Let me also thank our task force members, some of whom are here today. Obviously, they're the soul behind a lot of the work here, and I'm going to try to pull them into the conversation during the Q&A as well. And I think it's important to note that we really did attempt to bring a diverse set of opinions and perspectives to the table. Obviously, when talking about active defense, this isn't an issue that is unknown to anyone, but normally when the conversation begins, people are coming in with predisposed dispositions, and what we really attempted to do here was to try to define the poles between left and right, between simply reactive, build higher walls, deeper moats, and hack back. And there's a lot of space between those areas, and we worked to try to define what we thought a position would be going forward. Let me also just very briefly thank my own team here, my co-director, Christian Beckner, who's going to give a quick presentation on the report itself, Sharon Kardash, Taylor Brooks, and most especially Alec Nadeau, who coordinated this effort. So he was tireless in the thousands upon thousands of emails. We could almost come up with our own metadata in terms of what came into all of this project. And last but not least, the Hewlett Foundation and the Smith Richardson Foundation, who underwrote this particular research. Couple of very, very brief notes. I mean, firstly, this is not meant to be exhaustive. It's not the last word on active defense. But what I think it does do is set the table. It sets the context. It sets the parameters for a more constructive conversation going forward. So I wish we had an end-all, be-all, 100% consensus document, but we don't. And I actually think that's kind of healthy, since we intentionally brought in such diverse opinions to the fold. But what we did do is sort of define what the legal, technology, and policy space is. So hopefully we teed up all the right questions, and certainly from a contextual standpoint, I think we framed the topic as well as can be framed. The other takeaway that I think everyone does agree on is this issue is going to take on greater pertinence and prevalence, not only for our next commander-in-chief, but also for our next executives and CEOs in the private sector. So our hope here is that we defined the parameters in a healthy and constructive kind of way. I think we can all recognize and acknowledge that business as usual isn't cutting it, given the op-tempo of the cyber threat and the cyber risk. And I look forward to engaging all of you in a Q&A as we go forward. So let me turn it over to Christian Beckner, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Thank you, Frank. I'd like to give a very brief overview of the report, and then we'll turn it over to the panel for a broader discussion of the issues in it. And the full report will be available on our website during the course of this event. It should be up there by no later than 10:30. As Frank mentioned, we initiated this study last year to try to contribute to a public dialogue that had been largely focused on either purely defensive measures or so-called hacking back. And there had been some policy discussion on that middle ground between these two ends of the spectrum within the lens of the existing policy and legal framework. But I think what we've tried to do in this report is define a normative framework for active defense by the private sector, not just looking at sort of the way things are, but the way things could or should be, especially in light of the serious cyber threats that the private sector is facing today. So walking through the report very briefly again, the initial sections provide some current context on the cyber threat, an articulation of U.S. interests in cyberspace, and an explanation of the strategic context of active defense, in particular how it relates to the issue of cyber deterrence. Then in the next section, we clarify what we mean by active defense, first with a historical overview of the term, both as it's been used in a general national security context and more broadly with respect to cybersecurity, and then our attempt to define it both in terms of its upper and lower boundaries and then in terms of what falls between. And I'll briefly read the definition that we've come up with that's in the report. Active defense is a term that captures a spectrum of proactive cybersecurity measures that fall between traditional passive defense and offense. These activities fall into two general categories, the first covering technical interactions between a defender and an attacker. The second category of active defense includes those operations that enable defenders to collect intelligence on threat actors and indicators on the internet, as well as other policy tools, for example, sanctions, indictments, trade remedies, that can modify the behavior of malicious actors. The term active defense is not synonymous with hacking back, and the two should not be used interchangeably. With that definition, we then define a spectrum of activities that fall in between what's considered hacking back and what are considered defensive measures, things like coordinated botnet takedowns, beacons, honeypots, a variety of other measures, and assess them in a graphic that's in the report in terms of their relative risk, both in terms of the likelihood of effectiveness at countering a cyber attack, the risk of collateral damage, the legal and policy risk. And notably, as I mentioned earlier, we include within this definition of active defense non-technical measures that are intended to modify or reshape the actions of hostile cyber actors. And I think it's important to consider these tools as options in coordination with more technical measures, not sort of in isolation as a set of policy tools that are unrelated to those technical measures. The report then includes a short section that provides some additional policy and technology context on the issue of active defense, looking at the impact of technical developments such as the Internet of Things, cloud computing, providing some broader context in terms of some of the international policy and legal issues with respect to these sets of issues. And then after these introductory sections, we get to what's really the meat of the paper, where we define what we mean in terms of our framework for active defense. And the framework is that spectrum of active defense measures that we considered, embedded within a broader set of policy, legal, technical, and governance-related questions and considerations, which can provide the basis for risk-driven decision-making both within companies and between the government and the private sector. Basically a playbook for when or when not to act, informed by questions regarding effectiveness, your own capabilities, your relationship with the government, and the risks of action, or conversely, the risks of inactions. The report then concludes with 15 policy recommendations, which are intended to facilitate the implementation and adoption of such a framework and move the policy arena, the private sector environment more closely to the ability to implement and adopt such a framework. And I won't read all 15 of these, but just to highlight a few. First, for example, in recommendation number 1, we say that DOJ should issue public guidance to the private sector with respect to active defense measures that it interprets to be allowable under current law, indicating that DOJ would not pursue criminal or civil action for such measures, assuming that they are related to the security of a company's own information and systems. Such guidance should be updated on a regular basis consistent with ongoing developments in technology. It's worth noting that last week, DOJ released guidance that it had produced 2 years ago, but publicly released for the first time with respect to the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, in terms of when or when it would not prosecute under CFA under certain circumstances. I think that's a step towards this recommendation, but not all the way to it, because it addresses more some of the issues with respect to intent and things like that, and less with respect to specific types of measures. Another recommendation, again, to the federal government is that the federal government, led by NIST, should develop guidelines, best practices, and core capabilities for private sector activity with respect to assessing the risk of and carrying out various active defense measures with different levels of technical maturity linked to certification to carry out certain types of measures, or in the case of third-party vendors, to protect other companies. Such guidelines may be distinct for different industry sectors. And this effort would be similar to the work that NIST undertook in 2013 and 2014 to develop the cybersecurity framework. Another recommendation, given legitimate concerns about some of the privacy and legal related risks of action by the private sector that's captured within the scope of this report, is that, as part of this broader federal effort, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, which is established in law, should carry out a review of current and proposed federal government activities related to active defense by the private sector and release a public report on the results of this review. And we have a few other recommendations for the federal government and suggest that the next president should codify a number of these where appropriate into a directive that ensures that there's White House coordination and leadership on these. And then we also suggest that Congress similarly should pass legislation that reinforces the implementation of a number of these, and should also look at the language in the CFAA and the Cybersecurity Act of 2015 to figure out where the right balance is between ensuring that risky activities are not undertaken that could interfere with or degrade other IT systems, but ensuring that appropriate measures that the private sector can take, it should be able to do so. And that's not an easy lawn to dry, and I will likely debate this in the Q&A, but I think I don't think the current, I think, at least where the staff of the center is looking at this issue, that the current sort of status quo on this is not necessarily one that is going to best protect the private sector, best allow the private sector to protect itself against cyber threats. And then finally, a couple of recommendations for the private sector. First, that they should work together in coordination with government to develop industry standards and best practices with respect to active defense measures within their sectors and industries. And finally, that companies should develop policies at the C-suite level for whether they want to engage in certain types of active defense measures in response to hypothetical future attacks, instead of simply reacting after they've suffered a data breach or other form of cyber attack. They can develop operational templates based upon risk assessment, analysis of industry standards and best practices that can be integrated into their broader cyber strategies and incident response protocols. So in conclusion, it's, I think the report comes out that it's important for policymakers in the private sector to be proactive and collaborative in working to develop and implement policy solutions to this set of issues. Otherwise, there's a risk that policies will be defined in the future not in response to careful, deliberative thought and policy action, but in response to incidents and anecdotes. And too often in this town, we see policy being made in response to the latest terrorist attack, if we're talking about counterterrorism policy, or the latest major hack or data breach, if we're talking about cybersecurity policy. So, this effort, this task force, I think was an effort to try to get ahead of that risk and put forth a balanced framework that assess risks and benefits. And we look forward to continuing to engage with a variety of stakeholders in shaping these issues. With that, we'll turn over to the panel discussion and turn over to Sarah Sorcher, who will moderate the panel. Sarah is Deputy Editor of Passcode at the Christian Science Monitor, which is a media co-sponsor of our event today. So thank you, Sarah.
reactive defense and what companies should be able to do or not do. I think it would be helpful, given I know many of you in the audience have different backgrounds, to just start from the beginning and set the scene about what kind of digital threats are companies in the country facing, and what that landscape looks like. So maybe, Blair, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. We all sort of read the latest outrage that appears in our paper, our email notes. Company X hacked millions of dollars taken away, identities, and so on. But if you go behind the headlines to try to understand the characteristics of the threat environment, there are a couple of things that struck me over the years. One is the dynamic nature of this threat compared to the absolutely static nature of legislation, executive orders, organized government capability to deal with it. We are shooting so far behind the rabbit in this area that we'll only hit it if the rabbit makes another lap and comes back to where it was. It's pretty unlikely. So, yeah. How's that? Anybody in the far back? Oh, okay.
All right.
The front couple rows got the joke, but not the back. But I'm struck. I'm struck by the absolutely dynamic, pressing, fervent nature of the threat and our sort of clunky, slow pace of not only getting our act together as a government to deal with it, but much less trying to pass a legal or executive framework to deal with it. So, what I've been struck by is that the requirement that the government, who has the legal and regulatory authority for these matters, try to come up with a more dynamic way to deal with them. And the only way that I know that you can do that is try some of it and have a very good assessment function to know if you made a mistake or if you were effective. And that's incredibly hard for a government to do. When I was director of national intelligence, I can tell a story. Every year on 9/11 for a long time, and I think up to this date, the Al Qaeda put out a victory video and message. We knew they were going to do it. We knew a lot of the outlets that they were going to use on the net to put it out, and we sort of thought, I thought, that the American people expected us to make that a little bit harder for Al Qaeda to do that, if not to, scrag the sons of bitches and arrest them and all, which was not something we could do. But when we tried to get legal authority within the government to do this pretty common sense act, we found it was incredibly difficult. And the final answer that we received from the Office of Legal Counsel one year that I was there was, well, do a little bit of it and we'll let you know if it's legal or not. And so I just think our government activities are not commensurate with the speed and the dynamism and the resources of the threat that we're dealing with. So that being the case, I'm sort of all in favor of widening the number of people who can deal with this, and a lot of these skills are in the private sector. And then, but we very much, from a government point of view, have to watch it as we go and see if we've gone too far, see if we've made a mistake, see if we've been effective, see if the side effects of our activities have been worse than the problem we were trying to solve. And that's awfully hard to do in theory. You have meetings, people say, well, this will happen, that won't happen. So I'm very much in favor of this report being sort of a first step in getting us started in trying some of these active defensive, watching them as we go, seeing if they actually do provide a certain amount of deterrence to the criminals who have a pretty free run right now. The worst they can do is a tie. The best they can do is win, and then adjust it as we go along. So that dynamic nature of the threat is what really is what I really like to bring attention to.
Thank you so much, Admiral. Thank you for your leadership. It's interesting to me that having served in both the government and the private sector, I see a lot of, frankly, finger pointing at the other side, saying, you need to take more responsibility, you need to do more. First of all, I would say there is a lot that all of us on the task force can agree with. The premise that the threat is proliferating, that the speed, the dynamism, the level of difficulty is exponentially greater than it was even a year, 2 years ago, a decade ago. I think we also certainly agree with the premise that the government actors, well-intentioned and good-hearted people, are under-resourced in this area, and that, to paraphrase one of my favorite musicals, they are outgunned and outmanned. So those of you all need to go see Hamilton, apparently. That's a very well-known quote. So it is true that those two scene-setting principles are something I think we can all agree on. Where we might have some difference is the means to the end. And the end, again, we'd also would agree on that a national security depends on a healthy cybersecurity that is supported by the private sector as well as the government. But opening up the gray zone to even further private sector actors that may not have any kind of accountability to the person whose computer is damaged, or the entity that may be the way station on the road to chasing after the bad guy. It kind of reminds me of the constraints that we put on law enforcement as they are engaging in a hot pursuit. At some point, hot pursuit has to stop if there are lives threatened, if there are civilian resources threatened. These are hard questions, and let me stop by saying I really commend Frank and the work of the center in trying to open up this dialogue and make it not as polarized as it has been over the last several years. I know it's been incredibly hard work to bring all these herding these cats to this final stage. So congratulations, Frank.
Thank you, Nuala, and thank you, Admiral. Just a couple of quick scene settings. So, I mean, firstly, from a threat perspective, unless you haven't picked up a newspaper or don't have access to email, I think we're all aware that the op tempo and the speed and the significance of breaches and hacks are occurring at a greater pace than ever. Couple of quick thoughts. Not all hacks are the same, nor are all hackers. So one of the things we need to recognize is that there are certain actors and certain incidents that require greater response and recalibration and focus. Secondly, not all communities are ready to be able to lean in the direction that some of us pointed to on the far end of the admissible sets of actions. So part of what we're trying to do here with active defense, I see it as a subset of cyber deterrence. At the end of the day, we have not articulated and, more importantly, demonstrated a deterrent capability. And if you think about it, we treat cybercrime, we've got to stop blaming the victim, in essence. So cybercrime is one of the few crimes where we're blaming the victim. And what we need to be able to do is start flipping that equation, that we induce changes in behavior and pain on the perpetrator. So we tried to look at a whole host of steps. So in the physical world, imagine if our companies were getting robbed every day. The cyber equivalent is calling the locksmith. Obviously, that will never change the parameters of the threat environment. So we tried to look at what are some reasonable steps, what are some reasonable actions short of hacking back. We did not advocate hacking back because we don't want the cure to obviously, in some cases, potentially be worse than the disease. So ultimately, we did take a number, when looking at that threat environment, obviously there's certain steps that companies can take to make it harder. Think of suppressive fire in a military environment, to make it harder to access that territory. But we also recognize that certain steps on the far end are going to require collaboration, a real genuine public-private partnership between the government and the private sector. And there are precedents of late that I think have had significant impact and significant effect. There have been a number of botnet takedowns that have been coordinated between U.S. companies and law enforcement. So coordinated with the FBI here, with other law enforcement agencies here, extrapolated to bilateral relationships and agreements with some of the indigenous law enforcement, or more broadly with Europol. These are steps we wouldn't expect U.S. companies to take directly, but we do expect them to be able to do the forensics when they've got the data to turn it over to different entities who are in a position to act. And these are having some effect. And the reality is we need more of these entrepreneurial types of actions to be taken, because the threat environment, we're never going to firewall our way out of this. We're never going to react our way out of this. So it is looking at what are the logical tools that can be part of that solution set.
So this is a good place to jump in, I think. So for people who haven't read the report, I think it might be helpful to go a little bit more into the details. I know Christian brought up some of these points in his opening, but what exactly here are we talking about? I mean, I do feel like active defense and hacking back are terms that generally, at least around Washington and certain circles, you do hear used interchangeably. Might be good to, maybe Frank, if you want to pick a couple, maybe some of those lower risk ones that are in this gray zone of active defense and some of the ones that are higher risk, and why you think that those are more legitimate than those further steps of what you would consider to be hacking back.
And I will be brief, but if there's one takeaway that I hope everyone gets from this report and from today's conversation, is there's a lot of policy space between do nothing, react, and hack back. There are a lot of technical solutions that our companies have at their disposal, but they're somewhat uncomfortable engaging in some of those. Yet there are legitimate privacy and civil liberties issues we don't want to obviously cross. So at the very low end, so Congress last year passed CISA, which enabled information sharing between different entities. To me, that was circa 2001, to be absolutely honest. It was about at least 10 years too late. So I think at the end of the day, it's by no means doing no harm, but it's certainly not going to move the needle in the direction I think we need to be able to move towards. So at the very low end, it's more prescriptive information sharing. And again, just like not all hackers and actors are the same, nor are all defenders. I would say if we were to rack and stack the critical infrastructures that are most ready, financial services would be at the very top of the list. And it's not because it's all out of the bottom of their hearts that they're leaning forward. It's because they're losing a lot of money. They're losing trust. They're losing confidence potentially if they don't take active steps. So financial services, energy sector, these are sectors that are ready to start looking forward. But after more proactive information sharing, we looked at tar pits, sandboxes, honeypots. Are you all familiar, I would assume, with what some of these means are? But basically, these are in your network, techniques that you can use inside your network to lure people to be able to see what they're interested in, see what their tactics and techniques are, see potentially what their intentions and capabilities are. So that's at the very low end. Then you start getting to denial and deception, which is a technique anyone who's worked in the foreign counterintelligence environment is well aware of, but it's applying that in a cyber domain. More proactive hunting, where you do have companies that are engaged in this particular space. To beacons, where you can have beacons to notify when people are accessing, and potentially beacons that can track information in terms of where it goes from breach to access. And there are some potential privacy questions here. And then we get down to the more proactive steps in terms of intelligence in the deep web darknet. For those of you who don't know what the deep web and the darknet is, I mean, in a very simple way, about 90% of the information that's available on the internet is not on the surface web. So largely care of index data from Google, we're only seeing a small percentage of the information. Most of the sharing of information, selling of stolen information, buying of weapons, renting of botnets and the like, this is all occurring in the deep web darknet. So here you have more proactive kinds of steps companies can take to see how their information's being ultimately sold to highest bidders, whether it's PII information or intellectual property. The next level of steps we had advocated, we determined there needs to be a genuine public-private partnership in this respect, that companies should not be engaged independently and autonomously in botnet takedowns, and obviously a whole host of other steps. So that's just a very quick snapshot, but at the end of the day, I think that when what we tried to do is marry up Silicon Valley, Wall Street with Washington, D.C. on some of these issues, and then try to make sure that we had some of the privacy questions. When we had our sessions out in Silicon Valley, it was amazing in terms of what some of the technologies that are available but not being applied at this sort of, at this stage. And some of them, well-intended, could have real privacy implications. Others, I think it's how do you integrate it into your operations and decision-making.
Nuala, maybe you can jump in there, because I know that you had some concerns that maybe some of these activities would be a little bit too aggressive, and that's included in the report, which is very interesting as well. Can you run through some of your...
And I think it's important to note, I mean, the conventional wisdom is that privacy interests and privacy advocates are antithetical to national security and cybersecurity interests. And I want to disabuse you and to dispel that framework. Strong personal privacy is supported by an excellent cybersecurity framework. You have to have strong cyber in order to protect your data, your interests, your communications. And as individuals become kind of more reliant on their cyber communications to interact in their daily lives, we need to have, really indisputable, very strong cybersecurity for our ordinary communications. That said, if efforts to engage in cyber warfare should not be basically an excuse to engage in large-scale data dumps into the federal government. And so those are the concerns that CDT has historically had about, again, well-intentioned and legitimate attempts to solve this issue of the very fluid and kind of intertwined nature of private sector cybersecurity and government operations. And to Frank's point, it's interesting because I would take some of our conversations in Silicon Valley in another way. There's excellent thinking going on around not only de-identification, but kind of anonymization and efforts to see kind of large-scale pattern analysis and link analysis without going deep into the personally identifiable data of the individual. So I think that with good thinking, and I was so delighted to see some of the folks from my former employer, DHS, and the privacy officer, who think about these issues every day, about how to build in privacy principles and frameworks and values into well-intentioned, legitimate law enforcement and cybersecurity initiatives, but they have to be there at the beginning, and that value has to be a core value for our country.
And so some of the missions, the activities in the active defense gray zone are more aggressive than others, as Frank outlined. You have things like botnet takedowns or rescue missions to recover stolen assets, or white hat ransomware to shut down, lock up, attacker's computer until they release stolen data. And it's really interesting spectrum. Curious from a privacy perspective, or from even a cybersecurity perspective, what, Nuala, do you think is the line between, some of that legitimate activity that might be in the defensive space and something that might be more intrusive, and how does that play with you?
Well, I think it's the line between going inside your network and outside your network is a starting point. But I think we're a little too reliant perhaps on intent as a construct, and I might go with something a little stronger. And I think it's interesting that my issues with this construct are not only about data and privacy and the individual, but really rather about the dividing line between the government and the private sector. And that is a dichotomy that I really have been working on since my days at Homeland Security, and certainly in the private sector, that we shouldn't be playing cops and robbers when we are in the private sector. I would prefer language in the report that said something more like under the direction of the government rather than in collaboration with. But again, these are, reasonable minds can differ on the language and the construct. We definitely get the construct that the private sector is, is at risk and under attack. I certainly have saw that in my time in the private sector. So I think that, we would differ in measure, and there on the report as I was reading one of the drafts, I circled several of the issues in the gray zone with a big red pen and wrote no next to them. But I think that makes this a healthier conversation, that this task force doesn't always agree.
Admiral Blair, what do you think is the line between something that's a legitimate active defense activity and something that might be too risky?
Right. I think we didn't quite complete this conversation in the task force, but when you're dealing with criminal activity, you need to have enough enforcement so that the criminal stops and wonders, is it worth it or not, engaging in this activity? And there have been various studies of different categories of crime, and usually when they quantify the things, they find that around a 10% chance of being caught is enough for most criminals to say, I think I'll try something else. So I try to think of the active measures as having an element that will lead to the identification of the criminal who is doing this. For instance, a botnet takedown, it's wonderful to take out the bots, but the real thing is finding the gang at the end who were actually setting all that up, getting them arrested, and letting the word go out that this is a high-risk activity, and you might turn your computer skills to something more legitimate rather than that. So
Is that a government job or a company's job to track them down and find them?
Well, we like citizens to help the police, There they went, He had red hair and limping, and so I think that I think that an element of this public-private partnership and the activities that companies take should be helping the government find the people that you can actually go in, knock on the door, arrest, prosecute, put in jail, let the word go out, and turn all of this talent, which is now being directed against us, to more fruitful things.
Can I just pull just a quick thread? I mean, two things. One of the reasons we launched this effort to begin with, and Christian kind of mentioned the last thing we want to do is react to a particular precedent to then define a set of policies. I mean, you want to be able to think these issues through in advance. And I think it's fair to say there is going to be an overzealous response that, if we didn't think about that before, could escalate. So the last thing we want is a company taking down a server in Moscow or Beijing or Pyongyang or Tehran, or you name the national capital, that could potentially escalate into a hot war. That's the last thing anyone would want to see, unless it's coordinated. Maybe we do want to do it at that point, but then it would have to be a policy decision made by the government. But we don't want well-intentioned company being able to lead to that set of issues. But the flip side is government's not responding. Companies are losing. I mean, when you really get down to it, our whole economy is largely driven upon intellectual property. That's the engine driving not only today but tomorrow's economy as well. And if you're a bad guy, if you're putting on the red hat shoes or playing in a red teaming sort of environment, why spend billions in R&D if you can just steal it and spend your resources on gaining market share? That's not a viable solution set long-term from a U.S. economic competitiveness standpoint. So the question is, where is that right line? And I do think when you're talking about active forensics collection, when you actually have data, doesn't mean you have to respond. You're not going to arrest. You're not going to shoot. But you can turn that information into someone who can take it that next level. To me, that's that public-private partnership, which I've been known to say long on nouns, short on verbs. We've been talking about it forever. But when you really get down to what some of those verbs are in solution sets, this ought to be part of that equation. And while I very much agree with everything Nuala had said, there's one thing I would challenge, and that is technologically today, I don't know what the perimeter is anymore. I don't fully know what's inside and outside a network when you're dealing with a cloud environment, when you're starting to look at the Internet of Things. So rather than us come up with preconceived answers on that, we wanted to at least frame the parameters and throw that out there, because most cybersecurity is very much that. It's perimeter defenses. The reality is our fences are being breached regularly. So we need to think about that in a defense in depth kind of approach, which includes a proactive set of tools.
And I think when you're talking about some of the more aggressive active defense measures, or even some people I know, even in this room, support even more aggressive hacking back when attacked. So I'm sure, yeah. And we actually at Passcode had an influencers poll where we surveyed 160 security and privacy experts and asked them about hacking back. I know many of the influencers are here in this room, and 82% said, as we defined it, either shutting down computers targeting networks or retrieving stolen data should not be allowed. And I think even though, granted, we are talking about level of activities that might be slightly below that, I do think that some of the concerns raised there might still hold. I'm curious how you guys would react to them, because attribution was a huge concern. How do you justify these types of activities if knowing exactly who's behind the keyboard or what capabilities they might have, is still unclear if you don't know where the perimeter is? And just curious how that calculus factored into this report and your views on this.
Well, I would say that the activities that we cite specifically in the report, if done well, can be positive, and the potential collateral damage can be identified and either avoided or remediated, or ground into the next into the next iteration. So we were conscious of that. And I guess the other point I'd make is that the definition of criminal activity on the internet is expanding, and on those areas which are commonly acknowledged by many countries to be criminal, we see pretty good international and private sector cooperation on them. I'm most familiar with the Interpol Center in Singapore, of which China, which is the source of a great deal of intellectual property theft, is a very strong contributing member. And when it comes to ATM theft, when it comes to child pornography, the Chinese and the other countries are quite zealous about cooperating, taking information from the private sector, using government tools to try to take down the people who are doing it. Now, China has said that intellectual property theft is a crime within China, and there is some evidence that the Chinese courts are actually making judgments on that, and some of them in favor of international companies as well as just Chinese on Chinese companies. So if we can expand this sort of cooperation into the intellectual sector so that there is not a law enforcement haven in addition to a cyber haven for criminal activities, then I think these sort of cooperative measures can, as I say, raise the price of criminal activity on the net, which is what our objective is.
Yeah. Do you think companies' attribution is good enough that people can take on these activities?
I think it's a good starting point. Like any statement you take from a witness, you read it through, think about the technical veracity of it, and you think of the person who gave it to you, and so on. So I think it's the best starting point, because they after all are the ones who are primarily the victims of the crime, who will gather the information that the crime took place.
So misattribution risk obviously is a significant concern from our perspective, and I think given the wily nature of the criminal and their use of multiple servers and multiple systems and often noble entities like schools and hospitals and that sort of thing, I'm deeply concerned about the ability of the private sector actor and the government to correctly attribute the source of the attack. And again, this leads to the concern about private sector acting alone, because what kind of accountability and what redress does that harmed party have in the case of a private sector attack? And furthermore, how do they even know it's not a real attack? And then they end up hacking back, and then you're in escalation. But I'm so glad you brought up international issues, because the question on my mind also is, what do international norms look like in this space? And are we ratcheting up our response in a way that is going to, again, create kind of an increasing level cycle of attack on either side?
Just to underscore two very quick points. So we very much agree with the international issues and actually have a few recommendations, putting Department of State in the lead to look at some of these matters, because we do need norms. There's no question about it. It's a transnational set of issues. It's going to require, to one extent or another, a transnational set of solutions. But a couple of things. One, our steps in active defense actually will be helpful in defining attribution. So not all of these are hacking back. They're illuminating attribution to get a richer picture of what threat we're dealing with here. Secondly, if you look in recent years, it's been private sector entities that have probably done the most significant work in attributing attacks, whether it was the Mandiant report on Chinese computer network exploit and espionage, whether it's the recent CrowdStrike report in terms of the DNC hack. These are largely private sector entities that are doing that cyber intelligence. Now, I think you're starting to see the U.S. government lean a little more forward, like they did with the recent bulletin put out by both DNI and DHS attributing the recent attack. But by and large, historically, out of fear of compromising sources and methods, there was no incentive to lean forward by the federal government. So I think the private sector has actually helped kickstart some of that illumination. Now, is that going to stand up in a court of law? I think those are questions none of us have concrete answers to at this stage. But a long-winded way of saying a lot of the active defense measures we are advocating actually round out that attribution question. We don't suggest that companies go and respond through either shooting back or even taking down systems. So that's a line where we think the government needs to play a role. But here's one other dilemma with the international issues. About 80%, so we recently hosted the head of Europol, Rob Wainwright, and he said about 80% of the cybercrime activities they were pursuing were emanating out of Russia or Russian-speaking countries. So we need to recognize here that you've got digital safe havens in countries we don't have extradition. So even if you wanted to go that traditional approach, we're going to need to come up with other technical means to look inside the life cycle of the attack to prevent that. So not proactively hit back, but at least prevent that. So one of the things we did in this report is we looked at the kill chain process that Lockheed Martin originally defined, and we tried to reverse engineer it and look at various steps along the way where you could remediate that. So.
I guess just to explore one facet of that on the international consequences and just how this might relate to broader U.S. government policy, because as you mentioned, there are a wide variety of attackers, and many of them might be either just very directly linked to nation states. And so if you have Russian state, linked hackers attacking a company and they do take action, I mean, what is the concern that this could escalate and potentially draw the government into a wider conflict, and how do you prevent this from happening? Anyone?
Within government, you don't go to war lightly. Just because you got information on one hack. So I think the process of taking government action against another state is very deliberate. Gets a lot of there's a very high standard for proof that the reason that you would do it is in fact correct. We're all familiar with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which it turned out that the facts didn't support the action that we took. So I think we've learned from that. So I think the government has, in my experience, is pretty good deliberative processes when it comes to serious questions like that, and we can trust them to be operative in this case. In fact, if anything, I have seen a hyper concern by government just because of the sheer possibilities of widespread collateral damage and retaliation. So I'd say you don't really have to worry about at least the U.S. government getting carried away with escalation based on cyber incidents.
Yeah, but does it get murkier? Does it get murkier in this space when you have nation states or nation state linked actors attacking private companies, and then private companies, instead of going to the government immediately, maybe taking more action into their own hands? I mean, how do you prevent the government from being pressed to take, action because the situation has already escalated from a private company's actions?
So let's see, your scenario is a private country hacks into Russian government nets. Russia, thinking it's coming from the U.S. government, retaliates at a high level against the United States, and then we drop a bomb on them? Is that that basically
Not
what you're...
exactly. I think it's just the general risk. One of the concerns that people who are against hacking back mention is just that there is this risk of escalation, that the conflict could spiral between, state-linked attackers and a company, and instead of going directly to the FBI or the DOJ to report this and work in conjunction with the government, that they might take some of these actions to go into other networks or some of these things. So that's more generally my question. And if
Oh,
anyone else would
right.
like to
Well,
jump in.
yeah, I mean, again, it depends. It depends whether the company has a great deal to lose and is relatively mature, and none of the major companies with the most to lose is going to take a foolhardy action based on just a couple of indicators. It's going to be a considered decision on their part, and then I think there are other. What I found, even when the government is involved in cyber activity, it's very hard to keep it quiet, and stuff comes out, and the checks and balances we have within our system ask questions. Congress wants to know. Tough investigative reporters wants to know. People who used to work in government want to know. And so I find in this space that there are quite a few checks and balances against really rash actions, which would get us all in trouble.
Sarah, thank you for that question, because I think it makes a lot of sense when you're talking about deputizing non-government officials who are not constrained. The Admiral's description exactly mirrors my experience in the government, with great public servants trying to do the right thing, and if anything, more constrained and more thoughtful about the consequences. We would not be able to expect the same kind of training and discipline and decorum by private sector actors, again, when rightly indignant about the damage to their network and concerned about speed and velocity of response. That is, I think your question nails one of the weak points, which is the gray zone of actor and who is acting and under what authority.
Could I just underscore one other point here, and that is, I mean, quite honestly, the government has not clearly articulated and defined rules of engagement for engaging in computer network attack and exploit. And I feel the time, and not just our government, all governments. So ROEs are in short supply right now. And part of that is because cyber is its own domain, but the reality is it transcends all existing domains of air, land, sea, space, as well as traditional military. So, I mean, we need to think about this issue a little differently. And I would argue countries that are integrating computer network attack and exploit into their warfighting strategy and doctrine are going to be light years ahead in the days ahead. So I think ROEs are a big issue far beyond active defense. Our point is, in addition to government response, if you have private sector, it's going to induce potentially some changes in behavior. But to Nuala's point, there really have to be lines in terms of that, because ultimately what the government has is a lot more than the ability to just have cyber forensics. They've got all source intelligence that can provide a better snapshot and picture of what we're dealing with here. So this same set of questions is playing out in terms of the role of the Title 50 community, our intelligence community, and our Title 10 community, our military community. So we're actually seeing this play out in a different kind of way in terms of how we muscle up for conflict tomorrow, because every form of conflict will have a cyber dimension to it. And obviously, that is part of this set of questions.
This brings up one last question, then I do want to turn it over for audience questions. That's about international norms and rules of engagement. If the U.S. does come out and say, here's what we think is acceptable behavior for private companies more clearly than they are doing now, potentially, and some of those activities are more aggressive in this realm of active defense or hacking back even. I mean, is this okay? I mean, will other countries follow suit? Are you worried that there might be more action that could be taken by the private sector before there are rules of the road internationally?
My experience is that the value of the United States setting a fine example of self-restraint is way overestimated by people. Most of the criminal gangs and the criminally inclined countries that we deal with take American self-restraint as an excuse to attack more strongly and more effectively. So I think we should. That doesn't mean we sacrifice our values, but that doesn't mean that we break all ties on the side of restraint. As long as we're within what we've established are our procedures. If this involves going and taking strong action, I think we ought to do it. So I think that we will be more effective if we have fear and respect in this area rather than emulation.
Okay. Frank, do you want to jump in?
Other countries are already doing it, so it's I mean, most countries worth their salt are going to use proxies to do their bidding anyway, so attribution gets more difficult. I think there have been some advances in terms of some of the conversations President Obama has had with President Xi in terms of what targets are acceptable targets. So, I mean, it's an unfair playing field if you've got national intelligence assets and resources being aimed at U.S. companies. I mean, even the biggest companies didn't go into business thinking they had to defend themselves against foreign intelligence services. So I think part of it is then looking at how we flip that set of issues as well. So I think it's a great set of questions, and we need to live up to, obviously, our values globally. But the flip side is to think that other countries aren't doing it's a mistake. Almost all countries are using proxies to do their bidding, and it's happening as we speak right here.
Could I just add one last point, Sarah, which is being on this task force again reminded me of it. The tremendous advantage that the United States has is this huge talent pool of people men and women who have worked in intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies, and for private companies and for non-governmental organizations, and they don't forget what they knew in the other hats. And there's a great deal, I think, within the sort of group of Americans who are technically knowledgeable on this issue and who work in it, a great deal of respect for these three pillars of the government's role, the private sector's role, who needs to make money, and the role of those in the private sector who are sort of looking out for values and consistency over the long term. And I just observed in the task force itself, and I think it translates into policy, an American approach which will balance these things over time. And the key to balancing it is this group of people who really know what they're doing and can understand all of these 3 points of view, which are going to be in tension throughout the process. And it's pretty unique too. Even other democracies, the way they're set up, often don't have this sort of tradition of cooperation among the nonprofit, the profit, and the government sectors that we do. And so I think we're going to work our way to the right answers, and I think we should trust ourselves to be able to do it. And if we make a mistake along the way, we'll fix it, and we'll do it better next time, and we'll do it with our eyes open. So I think as I said in the very beginning, we ought to be pressing forward in this area with our eyes open, with the smart people involved, and we can hit these goals, which are always going to be in tension.
Okay. So audience questions, yes, Randy. Sorry, I guess myself. Yes, if you could actually just say who you are, where you're from.
Yes, I'm Randy Ford, former State Department. In your report, there's some recommendations about private sector doing some organization. So I was wondering, having not read the entire report, did you think about any new structures for how the private sector could coordinate? In particular, I'm thinking of the ISAOs that were prescribed by the information sharing analysis organizations that were prescribed by the administration a year or two ago. Are there any ideas that you all thought about that how to actualize your recommendation for the private sector to do this sort of sharing? Thanks.
Randy, great question. And yes, we did, including the ISAOs themselves. We looked at and the ISACs. But I don't think we came up with what would be 100% agreed to set of solutions. So there's the interagency piece, and then there's the private sector piece, and then there's the piece where they come together. And I would argue not all private sector either coordinating councils or information sharing and analysis centers are created equally. I mean, the gold standard is the FSISAC. And they've recently announced a new initiative along the lines of CyberArk, which is looking at longer-term sort of responsibilities of the biggest banks. So those that have systemic potential risk that our national economy could be degraded in a significant kind of way. So there are places we can plug in there, but we didn't come to a full conclusion. That would be a phase 2 set of topics. Again, I hope this is what sets the table for then a means to be able to drive some of these issues further. And there's some that I think are ready, but the reality is there are many that aren't. So the question is how do you do that? And Admiral Blair had some very good thoughts, and hopefully he'll share some of those in terms of how to work the interagency piece as well. But one thing to note is the private sector should have a front row seat at the national planning tables, not as an afterthought, not as this is a partnership. There's sometimes some arrogance in terms of what the government thinks a partnership is. I actually think they can start driving requirements. They can start driving the needs of what sort of information they have. Maybe then we don't have an active defense issue. Maybe if we actually got the intelligence picture fully right, we wouldn't have to lean in that direction. But right now, we don't. And right now, companies are going to potentially be out of business, so they've got a responsibility to engage.
I think in addition to the ISOCs and ISAOs, the one living example that we thought worked pretty well were the botnet takedown groups, which were pretty much ad hoc. Some cases even requiring the FBI to get a court order in order to take action. In other cases not. So if you could sort of bottle that set of partnerships, even though it didn't have a nice 4-letter acronym, that might be a good way to do it. And we talked also a little bit about the characteristics of a process or an organization. I think number one characteristic was deadlines. You just can't chew on these things for 6 months because they've gone down. So what are the processes within our government that have deadlines? CFIUS has a deadline. You either play fast or you don't play. So we thought that should be a characteristic. Inclusivity should be you don't just say, well, FBI alone should handle it when there are other government actors, DHS, defense, others that have a legitimate. So you got to play fast. You have to play comprehensively, and the one I added is you've got to keep good records so that if it goes right, you can bottle it and use it again. If it goes wrong, you know what happened, so you can avoid that again. So we talked more about characteristics, but we were unable to come up with with a handy, public-private strike force acronym that we all thought was good.
In the middle, back there.
Hi, Blake Hollister from the American Bar Association. You all talked about the need for norms. As I'm sure you're all aware, in 2015, the UN group of experts convened a conference and published 11 new norms that they thought would work. And that report was signed on by 22 nations, including US, Russia, and China. And I was just curious about how you thought some of these active defense policies would work in accordance with that, and if they encroach on some of those agreements that were reached.
That was the UN experts on cybersecurity report. Wasn't that primarily addressing cyber war and trying to bring the principles of warfare into the cyber area?
The 2013 report concluded that that was applicable to cybersecurity, but the 2015 one had just included policy things such as that states should not allow their territories to be used for intentional acts against foreign nations, and I was just curious if you thought that some of those active defense policies would impede that definition.
Oh, that right. And I think our general feeling on that was that none of those principles, those principles were probably pretty useful, but they didn't get you very far in actually doing something.
I would agree with that solution set. So we didn't apply it directly to the GGE findings, but at the end of the day, countries themselves are struggling with where does cyber fit into their defensive, all the sets of questions that governments are dealing with. And it's not to be trite, but I mean, a UN report almost by definition is going to be lowest common denominator. So in this case, we did not look specifically to the GGE findings other than to recognize that we do need transnational, we do need international. The most successful botnet, so we heard from tons of companies who were actively involved in what their tactics, techniques, and procedures were, how they would implement botnet takedowns, and that was probably a bridge afar from where the GGE is. They're just trying to get to the very basics to agree to.
Yes, this gentleman over here on the.
Preston Fraser, Northrop Grumman. I had a question that I wanted the panel to address from some of the comments that were made today. Regarding active defense, the panel said that we shouldn't blame the victim regarding attacks by nation states but yet we know that private sector sometimes doesn't do all it needs to do in defending themselves. And the panel also said that not everyone in the community is ready to lean in. So it's kind of, conflicting points. I just wanted the panel to expand on that.
Can I just respond? Because I think that's a terrific question and a great observation. And in the report, there is, I wouldn't call it a throwaway line, but there is a mention of the need for better cyber hygiene on the part of all private sector actors. And that, I think we cite some statistic that said, if everyone got to 90% of where they need to go, the other 10% could be the big incidents that the government weighs in on, and that would save some of the resources for the most systemic, global attacks. So I totally agree with you and take your point that we need to do, yes, there is a public-private partnership, but it is the private sector doing the private sector's work and the public sector doing the public sector's work.
And just one other point, and I really hope this doesn't come out. None of the steps we're suggesting should give the impression that companies shouldn't do the very basics, fundamentals, and the blocking and the tackling, because at the end of the day, a vast majority of breaches, over 80%, are still due to phishing, due to social engineering, and if we did have the equivalent of cyber hygiene existent in a majority of our companies, then we could actually titrate the focus of the government more smartly, where they can focus their limited resources on the very high-end threat actors and the advanced persistent threats, the so-called APTs of big nations. The problem is we're not at that stage right now. We don't have the hygiene, and everyone's fishing in the same pond, And at the time of the clickety-clack of the keyboard, when they're breaking in, you don't know what you're dealing with right now. So you've got an attribution issue, you've got a very fundamental, do the basics, and then you've got the how do you respond. So I really do appreciate that question, because the last thing I want to suggest is go calibrate entirely to proactive steps if you're not doing the basics. That's a must. That's a prerequisite. That's sort of a must-have.
About a year and a half ago, my car was stolen in downtown Washington at 3 in the morning. The only problem was I'd left the keys in the car, which made it considerably easier. And I'll never forget when the policeman came up to take my statement, and I said, you know, I feel really stupid, officer. I got to tell you, I left the keys there. That's why it was stolen. He says, well, shame on you, but just because you left your keys in the car doesn't mean somebody had a right to steal it. And so I guess that's how I feel about the question. My responsibility not to leave the keys in the car, but still, we try to knock the criminal element down to the point that you might be able to get away with one night that you left the keys in the car. No.
So I know we have a lot of questions, we'll try to move through them quickly, maybe we can even take 2 at a time. So we can start with gentleman in the second row and first row in the corner there.
Hi, my name's Ron Taylor. I'm with Frank's, senior fellow with Frank's Center, and unless he wants to deny me after I ask my question. But anyway, thank you for this. I think the work is really terrific. I think you put the issue of the private sector and active defense against cyber threats, you know, on the map in a very organized, structured way that it can be built from. The framework is great. I look forward to reading the report. My question is kind of a simple one. The lead part of the title is Into the Gray Zone. So that captures the eye, but you didn't talk about anything about Into the Gray Zone. I haven't read the report. So, you know, how does that add to the, you know, how does that relate to the framework? How does that add to the framework? What's the relationship there?
And we'll take another question as well. Did you still have a question?
I'm Jeff Starr, affiliated with Integrity Risk, a corporate risk investigative firm, and Neoprime Solutions, a cybersecurity firm. The comments of today's panel were focused on active defense, but as I listened to the panel, I heard quite a few examples distinguishing active defense from what it says in the report, don't hack back. That's not active defense, that's something outside of, so I'll call that offense or counter offense. But I heard a lot of discussion about botnet takedown, which I would kind of think of as more of a counter offense activity also. And so if you think of defense as passive defense, you have your endpoint solutions, your firewalls, whatnot. There's a whole, I guess the gray zone, is a whole gray zone of active defenses, some of which don't obviously merit concern about collateral damage. So it seems the central dilemma of the report is, what do you do to defend yourself more actively, but not create collateral damage? That seems to be the central dilemma question that
I think you answered Ron's question just right.
Okay, but then my question is what is, have you sort of racked and stacked all the active defense activities you considered according to risk of collateral damage? Because a lot of them, you know, intelligence gathering, I don't see why we should be concerned if companies engage in their own intelligence gathering of activities going on inside of their network. Deceptive defense, I'm not sure why that would be a public policy issue. And so some of the measures highlighted in the summary of the report that are considered active defense don't seem to create the dilemma of collateral damage that seems to motivate the panel. So I wonder if I'm missing something, or if you can comment, please.
Just very briefly, and more from a fact-based perspective. So the gray area were all the different techniques and measures we discussed, short of passive defense and long passive defense and short hackback. There is an actual chart in the report that has the full spectrum of activities we're looking at. Did we look at it from a pure impact consequence perspective? No, because the science isn't there yet to empirically be able to fully measure that. But that is a valid way to think about it. And everything from information sharing on the very low end up to tar pits, sandboxes, honeypots, denial and deception, hunting, beacons of different forms and how you apply and use them, to some of the intelligence gathering, more proactive intelligence gathering measures, which, by the way, deep web darknet's not in your network, so that's where you get into some of the gray area there as well. With botnet takedowns, that's where you're actually proactively, and that's where we think that they've had huge effect, but it requires and demands a cooperation between the public and the private sector. Microsoft, Symantec, and a bunch of other companies have actually been leading the way on some of this. We have a case study on the Google Aurora example in terms of how they engaged in this sort of activity in our report. So not enough time to get into all of that, but I think between the two of you, hopefully that answered some of that question. So.
Take, two more questions. We have the front row over here and over to the far side.
Hi, Rick Weber with Inside Cybersecurity. Can the panel expand on the recommendation on certification? You're talking about building on the NIST framework. Did you have discussions about how you envision that happening in terms of how you would certify?
Rich Cooper with Catalyst Partners, a senior fellow also with Frank's Center. All three of our panelists have been executive leaders in the federal government. You've all been part of transition teams. What would you put in your transition memo to the next administration on this issue?
Damn, Rich, you always get to the point.
I'm going to answer Rich's first. I think you can look at the recommendations, many of which I agree with, some of which I don't, but they're in the back of the report for the new administration. But overall, the meta issue really is that this is a serious, high priority issue for all agencies in the federal government, not just law enforcement, national security, and it hasn't been given enough resources and attention and talent, and that needs to improve in the next administration.
See, go ahead, Frank, on the first question. Let me weigh in later.
So remind me, the first question was on. So yes, we did look at that. We did look to what the parameters could be. I think we concluded generally that no one should be engaged in this without some level of education, certification, and third-party acceptance. So yes, that was definitely a central theme in all of our discussions, but we didn't come up with a concrete exactly how it should be done. In terms of transition planning, I actually think this issue, active defense, will be an issue that the next commander-in-chief will be grappling with, whoever she or he may be. But I think at the end of the day, you've got to look at this issue in a more systemic and systematic and strategic approach, because to me, active defense is part of a broader deterrent, and articulating an ability to dissuade, deter, and if need be, compel bad behavior. This would be one instrument in that approach. So I don't think it can be looked at in isolation of that, but I think that the actors who are going to play a significant role are not just going to be the alphabet soup inside the interagency. The private sector needs a seat at that table. So I think it's incumbent upon the commander-in-chief to ensure that this isn't just you've got 48 hours to comment kind of thing, but they're actually have a seat at the table deliberating.
I think we thought of three groups that should be present at the certification process. One would be law enforcement, so the FBI or equivalent outfit. The second would be some sort of a technical check on the claims being made by the person by the company that wanted to use a technique. And we do have things in government like the Safety Act, in which we certify technologies to DHS, done by an FFRDC and so on. So that component ought to be there. And the third should be, and we mentioned in the report, somebody representing the civil liberties and privacy side, whether it be a separate board or one of the boards that existed. And so we thought the representative of those three communities under a timeline would be the elements of certification process. And we also thought it, to the extent that we thought it through, we just had a few discussions in the task force. It should be a time-limited certification. You just don't give FireEye a next 20 years, whatever looks good to you. But it's based on a certain technique for use in certain circumstances.
And yes, we had a question there in the back.
Hi, my name is Harvey Shikoff. So in full disclosure, I was part of the process. I'm with the American Bar Association in Crowell and Mooring. I think when you look at the report, and I'd like to have the panel elaborate a little bit more, on page 13, there's a nifty little graph which sort of maps responses to the attacks. But the bottom three are probably the most interesting from this perspective, the range of questions, and the panel could elaborate would be great. The first is the responses to coordinate sanctions, indictments, and trade remedies. So we had the U.S. Attorney in Pittsburgh, David Hickton, was quite effective in that indictment and had a unique coordination with the people around Pittsburgh because they were so aggravated about what happened, and the private sector was willing to come forward, and the unique relationship he had. And we talked about that on the panel. It'll be interesting if you guys talk for the audience. And the second is white hat ransomware. So what that means and how that can be active. And the final is the concept of rescue missions and how that would be dealt with and what the liability would be and how there would be the ability for immunity, which is what the private sector is looking at when it acts. So if the panel could elaborate, I think the audience would find that an interesting element that's concrete for the next administration, because I think the current policy is a little bit undisclosed about how we understand sanctions and how we understand indictments and what we're doing with the intellectual property bar.
I'm happy to start, and then I'll ask others to jump in. So I do think that the Pittsburgh example was significant in that we indicted military officers from China, and it was one of the very first times we would be willing to, the likelihood of them ever seeing a courtroom is slim to none, but the evidence was 100% there. This was smoking keyboard kind of data, really deliberative, really factual, and I think that it definitely did signal and send a message. So for starters, these officers are not going to be able to travel elsewhere. So that will, anywhere that has potential extradition treaties with the United States, which I think has some significant effect in itself. But the broader question is, those do play a role. But again, what we're seeing is cyber transcends everything, and it's its own domain. So what we really need to do is how do we integrate all of these different mechanisms in the existing instrumentalities, methods, procedures, and approaches, as well as appreciate that none of those are owned alone by cyber. So it is a deliberative decision-making set of issues, and I would expand simply that the private sector, and I don't mean to discount the privacy, so they have to be. To me, any deliberative process in the government, they need to have a seat at the table, but it probably would help to have some additional outside sunlight on some of those decisions as well. So long-winded way of saying, I think those steps did have positive net effect, but I think that they're treated haphazardly. They're almost reactive. It was, you had an individual who had the relationships, who had the stomach, who had the wherewithal, who had the guts, and who put the blood, sweat, and tears to making it happen. We've got to move from personalities to processes, and that to me is the next level of steps, and the processes aren't there to make sure all the synapses are coming together. I'm going to have one of our senior fellows, Jeff Hancock, jump in on some of the white hat ransomware issues and some of the further end issues there quickly if he wants, and then let our chairs jump in.
Sure. So thanks, Frank. So certainly in the white hat ransomware aspect, right, that's been going on for some time now in the private sector. Obviously, to some degree unmanaged, but it's going on. There is value in being able to have that tool set in your tool bag, but it does go back to a political policy issue, right? Because are you going to badge an organization to go after doing this, or have that capability, or how do you monitor and manage that from a government perspective and then from an industry perspective? It's a challenge, and I think the first hurdle is really education, helping people understand what that means and the parameters of white hat hacking. So.
Anyone have any final words? I think this is
Yeah,
the last.
I would just say I had the same feeling on the task force, and I kept pushing for, well, what is the technique that will really work for us? And let's put it out in the report and say this is what we really mean. And I think the reality is that the techniques that are out there right now were not developed with an overall framework in mind. They were sort of developed to solve a particular problem, and then you put the user in the case of, well, is this legal, is this not legal, should I just give it a shot or not? And I think what we would find, the reaction would be, if the government were to adopt this sort of a framework and say, we are open to the working with the private sector on techniques which have the following characteristics, I think that we would find that things could be invented that would get around some of the difficulties with technical solutions. And I'm sort of reminded on, for a while we were so stopped by anonymizer. I mean, virtually everybody you talked to said, I don't know who made this tag jump through servers, and then techniques have been gradually developed in which have been breaking that down, and we can do a better job of doing it faster. So I guess what I would see this framework would be sort of unleashing the ingenuity of on the cyber side, on the cyber defense side, to match the unleashed ingenuity on the attack side, which certainly has plenty of incentives as it is, and doesn't need many more, and that we can come up with good things on this basis.
That's a great way to end on, I think. And thank you so much to all of you for coming.
Thanks so much.